to today's凱達格蘭 Forum. We'll proceed to the next panel discussion, Sailing Through Troubled Waters, How Quad and Quad Plus are Meeting the Challenges of the Indo-Pacific. Now please welcome the moderator of panel discussion 2, President of the Prospect Foundation, Lai Yizhou. Welcome.
Welcome, everyone. Now we come with our session 2. The theme of session 2 is Sailing Through Troubled Water, How Quad and Quad Plus are Meeting the Challenges of the Indo-Pacific. I believe the question is self-evident. Yet, the issue about the Quad, which could be said is one of the most consequential setup in the last several years in the Indo-Pacific. Of course, with the Quad, right now there are a lot of questions, but also a lot of the expectations about how this Quad will evolve and what Quad could do. So today we have gathered 4 distinguished scholars, but they are also the great policy practitioners in the past. The first one is the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Peter Jennings. Before he assumed the current position, he was, hi Peter, he was also the senior official for the Australia Department of Defense and Australia Strategic Policy Establishment. And he will be followed by retired Admiral Sunil Lamba. He is now the chairman of the India National Maritime Foundation. And before his retirement, Admiral Sunil Lamba, he was the chief of the Indian Navy. So that we are very honored to have him with us here. And then, after our Indian Admiral Lamba, he will be followed by the Dr. Taniguchi Tomohiko from Japan. Professor Taniguchi Tomohiko, he's a professor of the Graduate School of System Design and Management, Keio University. But before that, Professor Taniguchi was also the chief counselor for the Prime Minister Abe, and he was instrumental in many of the Prime Minister Abe's foreign policy initiative. And of course, last but not the least, many of us we all know very dearly is the Dr. Michael Green. Michael Green, he's now the Senior Vice President of Asian Japan Affairs, and chairs, for the Central Strategic and International Study of the United States. And Michael Green, before he joined the CSIS, he was the Senior Director of Asia of the United States National Security Council. But unfortunately, due to his time constraints, Dr. Michael Green cannot join us live today, but nonetheless, he still pre-recorded his speech. So we'll welcome for his contribution. So without further ado, let me welcome Dr. Peter Jennings from Australia to give us your remarks. Peter, please.
Thank you, President Lai. Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's good to see you and my distinguished colleagues on the panel. I'm going to talk to the panel's topic of Sailing Through Troubled Waters, How Quad and Quad Plus are Meeting the Challenges of the Indo-Pacific. The arrival of the Quad as a grouping of Australia, Japan, India and the US, being driven by the heads of government of each country, is a significant and welcome development. This, in fact, may be one of the few positive outcomes to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic. It would have been challenging to coordinate regular face-to-face meetings for the Quad heads of government, and the requirement to meet virtually has allowed faster development of Quad engagement. Speaking frankly, the other driving factor in the Quad has been the People's Republic of China. Each of the Quad countries has experienced the difficulties of dealing with a more assertive Beijing, of having to respond to the aggressive wolf warrior rhetoric, dealing with large-scale cyber intrusions and the rest. While each Quad country has its own equities to manage with Beijing, all are identifying a more of a shared interest in grouping together. So, will the Quad succeed? My answer is a cautious yes. We need to be realistic about the situation. The United States is beset with internal challenges which will be the top priority for the Biden administration. Washington wants its friends and allies in the Indo-Pacific to do more heavy lifting in regional security. Australia and Japan are two of America's closest allies in the region and increasingly like-minded on strategic outlook. In fact, the trilateral Australia-Japan-US relationship has the potential to become a powerful shaper of regional security. But Japan still has some internal political and cultural constraints on its military posture, and Australia is still deciding how far it can or should play a leading as opposed to a supporting security role. India, for its part, is a friend but not a treaty ally of the United States. New Delhi is shaping a new international security role for itself with roots in its non-aligned past. I expect India to play a more cautious role within the Quad. It will not want the grouping in particular to be seen as directed against China. So I suggest, colleagues, that the best approach would be for the Quad to build for its own success by pursuing a five-part strategy comprised of the following elements. First, it should set its agenda at the head of government level. The Quad is going to work best if it's driven from the top down. Asking for bureaucracies to shape a creative policy agenda is unlikely to produce quick results. But if the President and three Prime Ministers can shape an agenda and use their positions of power to demand outcomes, then the Quad will quickly gain strength. Now, pleasingly, this does seem to be happening. President Biden clearly wanted to be seen giving priority to a Quad leaders meeting soon after his inauguration. And the first virtual meeting of the Quad heads of government, held on the 13th of March this year, announced an intent for a physical meeting before the end of the year, and it set out a substantial work program. Second, I would say that the Quad should focus on the positives of democratic cooperation, not on the PRC. As Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison said last June, this is a quote, "We see the Quad together as leaders as an enabler. We see it as an accelerator of freedoms and prosperity and living standards within our region." So the aim is to sound a positive tone and to create another opportunity to demonstrate the virtue and value of liberal democracies and to see the market succeed. My third recommendation is that we need a practical work program of activities. And again, there has been a promising start. The virtual leaders meeting issued not only a vision statement on behalf of the leaders, but also a Quad Summit fact sheet, which said that 3 working groups had been created to work on vaccines, climate, and critical and emerging technologies. And in each case, those working groups have got a substantial agenda of work in front of them. So these are big undertakings, and one sets a huge test for Quad administrators. Fourthly, we need to expand practical Quad defence and security cooperation. Between Australia, Japan and the US, there has been an ever-thickening pattern of bilateral and trilateral defence cooperation. But Australia has struggled to deepen extensive practical defence cooperation with India. So I think the India-Japan and India-US defence engagement has been growing, but from a low base. So the Quad offers a good opportunity to expand four-way military-to-military engagement. And again, we're seeing that happening. Australia joined India's maritime exercise Malabar in November 2020. And just recently, the Indian Ministry of Defence announced a task force of India's Eastern Fleet to come into Southeast Asia, the South China Sea and the Western Pacific, where again Australia will be able to participate in the Malabar exercise in 2021. On the question of Quad engagement with Quad Plus partners, I think one element of the international response to PRC aggression has been to bring to the fore a range of different countries and groupings now increasingly looking to find ways to get strength in numbers to resist PRC pressure. Now, while this has been far from perfect, it suggests that the Quad countries are likely to find willing partners interested in focusing on ways to strengthen the international system. I would say the Quad is at an early stage of development, and that suggests to me it should resist attempts to open its membership to other countries until such time as Quad countries have developed a sense of comfort in the shape, the weight and direction of their own cooperation. But that still leaves open the possibility for making specific activities Quad Plus, depending on the interest and availability of other partners. So in conclusion, I would say the Quad is a valuable new grouping in Indo-Pacific security, perhaps most useful for the three allied countries, the US, Japan and Australia, to engage India. The Quad's value is that it creates a way for democracies to cooperate in developing positive strategies to enhance regional security. Hopefully, this form of cooperation will consolidate, broaden and strengthen, and give other countries the hope that there are ways to preserve the international order to the benefit of free societies. I'll finish my comments there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, for your remarks. You talk about the 5 recommendations regarding the Quad and how to advance these cooperations. So next, I'd like to invite Admiral Sonia Lamba from India. I believe that one of the new development in India Navy is that August year 2021, just this month, the Indian Minister of Defense announced that the task force of Indian Navy's Eastern Fleet is scheduled to proceed on an overseas deployment to Southeast Asia, the South China Sea and Western Pacific from early August year 2021 for over 2 months. So many of us believe this is a very different and probably even the watershed moment for the naval engagement of India to the western side of the Pacific. So probably according to your speech of the Quad, and also we would like to hear more about the Indian naval activities in this region. So thank you very much. Admiral, please. Admiral, we can probably, could you unmute yourself?
President Lai, thank you very much. My co-panelist, good evening and good morning to all the participants. It's an honor to be here in the forum. The term Indo-Pacific has assumed ascendancy in the larger global debate today, and we see many differing views. In his keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2018, our Prime Minister spoke of a free, open, prosperous and inclusive Indo-Pacific region, one that is founded on the cooperative and collaborative rule-based order. This approach has a high degree of consensus and acceptability among many like-minded nations. Okay. Indo-Pacific is also too vast an area to be measured with one common yardstick. It is dominated by the maritime environment, and the contours change and vary from the sub-regionals contained within it. I think the best example is the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, two important sub-regions of the Indo-Pacific. And there are a plethora of risks, challenges, threats, as well as avenues of cooperation and collaboration. And there are, of course, convergence, which we need to identify and analyze how to aid cooperation and how to go ahead in the future. Holistic maritime security is a key to stable, secure, and peaceful maritime environment, and is not limited to traditional military or hard security alone, but also encompasses multifarious facets of collective or common maritime security. Within India, there has been a renewed focus on issues maritime, and India has started to engage in a number of dialogues with like-minded nations. There has been a revival of Quad, as Peter has said. There's also 2+2 at the ministerial levels between United States, Australia, and Japan, and a few other countries. There are maritime dialogues, there are staff talks which take place between the navies. And the Indian Navy over the years has played a key role in placing countries in our neighborhood at the heart and soul of a larger Indo-Pacific engagement. Like Peter mentioned, we have seen the inclusion of Australia in the Malabar exercise and Quad gaining center stage. And like it or not, the Malabar series and Quad will be symbiotically connected. And the task force which you mentioned, which our defense minister announced, is there in the South China Sea and the Southeast Asia, is now going to undertake this year's edition of the Malabar of Guam, and I think is taking place sometime this week itself. As was illustrated by Foreign Minister Mr. Jaishankar at the second quadrilateral ministerial meeting conducted in Tokyo, that advancing security and economic interests of all countries having legitimate and vital interests in the Indo-Pacific remains a key priority. Therefore, need to work together and formulate a broad sense of structure, intentions, and goals for the Quad. Peter's also already made a mention of the summit level meeting between the heads of state and the 3 working groups which were set up. And I think among the most important of the working groups is the technology working groups which facilitate cooperation or setting of international standards. This is one role which the Quad is very important, that we need to have common international standards and standards not written by China. But there are, if you look at the 4 Quad countries, there are common interests, and they are deep interest in maintaining a stable balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, interest in deterring the use of force or coercive practice to resolve political and territorial disputes in the region, especially the Chinese territorial claims in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and on our land, northern land borders. There is an interest in maintaining maritime order based on free movement of goods and services across the oceans. There is a commitment of all the 4 nations to the current rule-based economic order. And less emphasized among the common interests is that of supporting and strengthening liberal democratic governments within the Indo-Pacific. President Xi Jinping's adequacy of China's development model of authoritarian capitalism being better alternative than liberal democracies is, I think, one role which the Quad can play. Although the 4 countries agree that China's action and policies are a threat, but there are also diversions between the Quad members. And I think the principle being different threat perceptions. The existence or absence of a direct territorial disputes. There are only between the Quad members, territorial disputes with China are only there with India and Japan. We face a very specific challenge on a long northern border. And one has to be conscious of the fact that China's economy is 5 times ours. The defense budget is 5 times our defense budget, and we have challenges of how much money we can commit to the defense. We also have to look at the social needs of a very large population of ours. And also the perception and potential or risk of retaliation by Beijing differs between the 4 members of the Quad. And there are also limitations of the strategic culture in each of our countries. But the strategic consequence of China's rise is aggressive military posturing, and the tendency to use threat of force have become more prominent in the region. If the Quad's progress has been somewhat hesitant in the past, I think China's role in trying to change the status quo has been the binding factor in the last 2 years, and there has been a great progress in what the Quad have achieved. And based on China's behavior being more assertive, many government strategic calculations have also begun to change. We have seen ASEAN's adoption of an outlook of an Indo-Pacific policy in 2019, which earlier they're not even willing to use this term. So there is a slow and steady institutionalization of Quad, and the expansion of Quad in the future, Quad Plus, is a real possibility. It makes sense for a number of reasons. One is the common security concerns which countries have regarding China's behavior. Each having faced Chinese pressure in recent years, our concerns regarding China's military and political expansion into areas they considered their neighborhood. And together this provides for a pragmatic path for greater security cooperation by a Quad Plus arrangement in the near future. What we can do is Quad could become sort of a rolling coalition, allowing countries to make unique contributions at key times to deprive China its ability to secure a fait accompli. Countries could work bilaterally or trilaterally to respond to novel ways as the strategic environment changes in the future. And Quad could be a collaborative arrangement built of a network of bilateral and trilateral partnerships, making it flexible and responsive to decisive threats. But I think this will take some time. The Quad countries have just come together in 2017 after a hiatus of over a decade, and great progress has been made in the past 3 years. But there is a great future, in my opinion, for getting more countries on board. But each will take a call on what economic linkages which all the countries, even the Quad members, have with China, and the larger number in the Indo-Pacific will be a factor which will be borne in mind. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amaro, for your remarks. I think definitely we all agree with you that the Quad, although just established about 2 or 3 years ago, but it has a great future ahead of it. And also, one of the driver for the establishment of Quad is definitely the strong authoritarian state like China, willing to change the status quo, and the current institution in Asia Pacific hasn't been able to really meet the challenges. So that the Quad institution like Quad is designed to specifically try to defend the democracy as well as a rule-based liberal international order. So with that in mind, I'd like to invite Dr. Taniguchi for your remarks. And I believe you also talk about the Prime Minister Abe, his thinkings regarding Quad. And because I believe you are, there's no better interpreter than you are in terms of interpreting what the Prime Minister Abe, his policy, other than Prime Minister Abe himself. So Dr. Taniguchi, please.
Notwithstanding that, views I'm going to share with you are strictly my own, I have to say. Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you all. Shinzo Abe, shortly after he took office as Japanese Prime Minister for the second time at the end of 2012, published his views on Indo-Pacific maritime security at Project Syndicate, an online op-ed publication. The title, Asia's Democratic Security Diamond, spoke volumes, as the article advocated that thenceforward Japan, the United States, Australia, and India, as like-minded, rules-abiding maritime democracies, should join forces substantially more to preserve the rules-based international order in the Indo-Pacific region. Prior to that, in August 2007, Mr. Abe addressed the joint house of the Indian Parliament. Many in India, Australia, and the US refer to the speech as has given birth to a new geographic concept of Indo-Pacific. For the title he gave to his speech was Confluence of the Two Seas. It was an attempt to replace the hitherto prevalent idea of Asia-Pacific with Indo-Pacific. A diamond-shaped relationship would emerge if the 4 dots of Tokyo, Delhi, Canberra, and Hawaii were to be connected, or so Mr. Abe argued. This was the genesis of what would later be called Quad, The diamond, or the Quad, was so designed from the beginning as to cover the vast stretch of the Indo-Pacific seascape, at the strategic center of which lies Taiwan, needless to say. For to allow Taiwan to go under the rule of the Chinese Communist Party would be tantamount to ridding Japan of its strategic autonomy. In such circumstances, the Japan-based U.S. forward deployed forces would also lose much of its strategic capabilities, with Taiwan under the CCP rule envisaged to reinforce People's Liberation Army's anti-access and area denial capabilities. Seen from the U.S. perspective, to lose Taiwan would be not unlike losing Japan as its staunchest ally, and by extension, losing the Indo-Pacific as a whole. Becoming aware of that dire possibility, albeit belatedly, U.S. strategic planners under both the Donald Trump and Joe Biden administrations chose to adopt the geographic concept of Indo-Pacific as well as the Quad, both the inventions of Mr. Abe's. Japan under Prime Minister Abe started to substantiate its deterrence capabilities with Taiwan-related contingency scenarios firmly in mind. The consequences include the following. Firstly, Sino-Taiwan exchange of hostilities will automatically activate Japan's collective self-defense, bridging seamlessly two forces of Japan's and Australia's, which is an arrangement that had been unimaginable till the Abe administration made it constitutionally possible. Secondly, it is now possible for Japan's self-defense forces, SDFs, to provide security to military assets most pertinent to Japan's own security of partner nations that range from its treaty alliance partner of the United States to Japan's quasi-allies, Australia, India, the United Kingdom, to name only three. In 2020, the SDFs gave security cover to U.S. military aircraft and vessels 25 times. In the preceding years, the activity numbered only twice in 2017, 16 times in 2018, and 14 times in 2019. The trend line has ascended sharply. Thirdly, in the area of intelligence collection and analysis, Japan, again under the Abe administration, caught up with peer democracies. That was because the administration passed the Diet, Japanese parliament, a bill to protect secrecy of sensitive military intelligence. Now, admittedly, only belatedly, Tokyo has an intelligence community that deserves its name, with its nerve center residing at the newly established National Security Secretariat. US NSA, for instance, knows who to call in Tokyo. Fourth and finally, the SDFs now operate cyber and space command structures, again in tune with partner nations, notably the United States. At this point, a note on the Senkakus is in order. What is true of Taiwan also applies to the Senkakus. That is to say, the question is how Taiwan could maintain its strategic autonomy when the Senkakus were, quote unquote, lost. Suppose the Senkakus were under China's military control. Taiwan's strategic space would be dramatically narrow. Assume also that the Philippines remained uninterested in working on Taiwan's behalf militarily. Taiwan would likely end up being sandwiched from the north as well as from the south by the PLA Navy. Hence the question, how could Taiwan maintain its autonomy once the Chinese robbed Japan of the Senkakus? Aware that the issue could be a divider between Taiwan and Japan, would it not be time for Taipei to recognize Japanese territorial sovereignty over the group of islands and islets? I pose that question with a view that the Senkakus should not be used by the Chinese as a wedge between Taiwan and Japan. The Quad, if I may come back to that point, for now has no prospect of it becoming institutionalized. It is an important flagpole, though, for Australia, India, Japan, and the United States to hoist a banner, one for democracy, respect for human rights, and for the rules-based international order. Legitimacy of all kinds is on the side of freedom-loving nations, not on China's side. The banner symbolizes. Put differently, it is one way to make Chinese expansionism more costly in the eyes of the world audiences. Before it in any way becoming an institution, using the Quad as a handily available platform, leaders of the four nations must develop a habit of cooperation on all aspects pertinent to the security and well-being of the peoples of the four countries, from military to military, co-development of technologies to setting norms and rules where necessary, such as in space explorations. Should the Quad be broadened to include key ASEAN member nations? What of Europeans such as the UK and France? I would rather see cohesiveness among the four first, before diluting the essence of the fledgling group. It is too early to discuss enlargement when, in fact, nothing cohesive has yet to emerge. In conclusion, suffice it to say that a stronger sense of responsibility among leaders of Japan, India, Australia, and the US has galvanized the four nations to, quote unquote, flock together like birds of a feather. That is the Quad. It is to invest into building a securer, more peaceful, and a more sustainable rules-based Indo-Pacific region. To reiterate, in the Indo-Pacific seascape, Taiwan security is a central piece. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Taniguchi, for your emphasis about the Taiwan security is a central piece of the in the Quad, and also you mentioned about the centrality of Taiwan in the Asia, in the Abe, Prime Minister Abe, his Asia Diamond. So with that, we appreciate the recognition publicly very much, and also you mentioned about the Japan's role in terms of how the Taiwan contingency happened, and probably you are also telling us that you will be more active rather than some people suspected it will be more of a passive response from Japan regarding the contingency in Taiwan. So thank you for clarifying that as well. And of course, you also mentioned one of the very touchy issues in the Senkakus, which Taiwan and Japan both claim the sovereignty over that area. I think the issue how we deal with it is actually add up to the strengths of the Taiwan-Japan relations. First of all, despite the claiming of sovereignty of the same area, the people of both Taiwan and Japan, we still love each other so much. And the relationship hasn't really gone off the rail as we speak. And also, we were able to finish a agreement for the shipping in that areas. So I'll say that the Senkaku dispute between Taiwan and Japan is actually witness the kind of strength of the Taiwan-Japan partnership. So the good friend, we're able to deal with it in a civilized way and actually to encourage the cooperations. And I'll say that both Taiwan and Japan, we also have a consensus in that area that both of us, we do not want China to dominate and to control that. So that is another things that we can work on. So without further ado, let us hear what the Mike Green will want to say. He has pre-recorded his message, and so Let's just hear it, what it's going to offer to us.
I'm very pleased to speak to you all today. I wish I could be there in person. About the US, Japan, Australia, India Quad, this new and yet old formation of maritime democracies in the Indo-Pacific that has emerged as really one of the important pillars of the Biden administration's policy towards the region, as well as Japan's and Australia's and increasingly India's. Where did this Quad come from? Where is it going? What are the challenges it faces? And what are the opportunities, in particular for Taiwan, which when you think about it lies right at the center of these four great maritime nations' reach into and across the Indo-Pacific. I was there in some respects at the creation of the Quad. It was December 2004, a massive tsunami and earthquake had struck across the Indian Ocean on December 26th, the day after Christmas. In the White House, where I was the senior advisor to President Bush on Asia, we did not know initially how extensive the damage was. But as we used satellite imagery and heard reports, we came to understand that this was a massive, massive human tragedy, with people from Sri Lanka to Thailand to Banda Aceh, Indonesia, killed, their villages destroyed, and the governments unable to reach those villages to give supplies. And importantly, at that time, in the context of the war on terror, Islamic terrorist groups like Jamaah Islamiyah in Indonesia trying to get to those devastated areas first to gain control for their own nefarious ends. We, on about December 28th, spoke to our counterparts in India, Australia, and Japan, and on the suggestion of the U.S. 7th Fleet Commander, whose carrier task force was steaming from Yokosuka, Japan to the Middle East and happened to be in the Indian Ocean at the time, to propose a quadrilateral task force that would reach quickly these isolated and damaged communities with the help of the governments in those countries, in Sri Lanka, in Thailand, in the Nicobar and Andaman Islands, in Banda Aceh in Indonesia. And within about 12 hours, the US, Japan, Australian, Indian governments agreed to put together this task force. We had never operated in this unit before, but it came very naturally to these maritime democracies, in part because our navies knew each other. The 7th Fleet was home ported in Yokosuka, Japan. The Australians, of course, are very close US allies and have been in almost every conflict that we have fought with us alongside, really since the First World War, when American troops served under General Monash on the Western Front. India was new, but the US-India relationship had really transformed towards the end of the Clinton and especially in the Bush administration. So in very quick order, we put together this task force, provided relief, saved thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of lives, plugged in other contributors to this effort, including, of course, Taiwan, but Canada, Britain, and even China sent a mobile hospital to Indonesia towards the end of the crisis. Late, but nevertheless showing up. When the task force concluded its work and the navies returned to their regular missions, we began thinking in the Bush White House about whether this fast and impressive operation by four like-minded democracies might become something more permanent. And my boss at the time, Steve Hadley, who was National Security Advisor, gave a speech that didn't get much public attention, which considered whether this might be a formation of countries for the future. That idea was picked up by Shinzo Abe, who was preparing his bid to be Prime Minister of Japan in 2006, and wrote in his book Utsukushi Kunie, his manifesto for leadership, that he would like to host a US, Japan, Australia, India summit of the Quad countries. The problem, of course, was that the politics and the geopolitics had changed by then. In terms of geopolitics, the United States and Australia, and in its own way Japan, were bogged down in Iraq. The idea of a Quad summit struck a number of people, particularly on the left in these countries, as neocon, overemphasizing democratic values. At that time, increasingly people in Japan and India and Australia and the United States were arguing we needed to engage Beijing more directly in strategic dialogue. That's about the time Secretary of the Treasury Paulson started his strategic economic dialogue with China. But the politics were changing. The Bush administration was in political trouble, did not have the bandwidth. Under Secretary of Treasury Paulson was trying a new grand bargain with China on economic issues. In Japan, Abe was replaced by Prime Minister Yasuo Fukuda, who preferred a more measured and careful approach to Beijing. He was pro-alliance, affectionate to Taiwan, but he didn't want to take on something that to him looked like a neocon effort. And in Australia, the Labour Party came to power, and Prime Minister Kevin Rudd had a decidedly more ambivalent view towards the Quad, and his Foreign Minister, Stephen Smith, declared publicly Australia would not participate in a summit. So the Quad fizzled in those years. It came back again in the era of Xi Jinping, particularly after China used coercive force in the South China Sea and against the Indian army in the Himalayan mountains at Daklan, expanded its patrols into the Natuna Sea, beyond the South China Sea, around Indonesia, boycotted Australian wine and other exports to punish Canberra for supporting democracy, for supporting Hong Kong's relative autonomy, for calling for an inquiry into the sources of COVID-19 in Wuhan. And all these things angered Beijing, which demanded Australia silence itself. The Australians, being proud people, refused, and China has imposed and still has on Australia a major boycott. And of course, major pressure on Taiwan and an increase in Chinese PLA, Navy, and paramilitary, Coast Guard, and fishery militia operations around the Senkaku Islands, the Diaoyu, which for Japan, of course, is a core security issue. So all four countries faced a new and more aggressive, more coercive, more assertive China under Xi Jinping, particularly after 2014 and 15. And the Obama administration had tried strategic reassurance with China, had tried even to explore Xi Jinping's proposal for a new model of great power relations. The bipolar U.S.-China emphasis in American strategy was at the fore in the Obama years after 2013. But by 2015-16, the Obama administration came to realize fundamentally the nature of Xi Jinping's approach, particularly after Xi, having promised President Biden he would not militarize these newly constructed islands in the South China Sea, began deploying all kinds of weapons on them that we could see clearly by satellite. So the Trump administration came in, and of course, President Trump had something like no interest or even bad ideas on foreign policy, but his administration was staffed at the top by traditional national security conservatives who liked the Quad, who liked balance of power, who liked the idea of complicating China's plans for hegemony in Asia. And under the Trump administration, Secretary Mike Pompeo and others elevated this U.S., Japan, Australia, India Quad to a foreign ministers meeting. Then in 2020, Joe Biden won the election. Many, I think, in India, Australia, and Japan were worried the Biden administration might go back to the old way of the Obama administration, which had both positive and negative views about how to approach China from the perspective of external balancing and alignment with allies. But in fact, Joe Biden had been reading the reports. He knew the nature of Chinese coercion. And he put in charge of Asia policy my good friend and a good friend of Taiwan's, Dr. Kurt Campbell at the White House, senior coordinator for the Indo-Pacific. And the centerpiece of Biden's approach to the region from the beginning was the Quad, and an early virtual summit of the four leaders hosted by President Biden, in which, interestingly, President Biden called out and thanked President George W. Bush for starting the Quad, which was smart politics, but also demonstrated that the Quad now in the United States has bipartisan support. In the Obama years, that wasn't quite the case. In 2012, in public opinion polls, a plurality of Americans said it is better to deal with China by working directly with China, even if it hurts our allies like Japan or friends like Taiwan. That was the general zeitgeist, the view in the US in 2012 or 13, before Xi Jinping fully took power. In 2019, that reversed, and 2/3 of Americans in the public said the best way to deal with China is by strengthening our alliances and partnerships. And among thought leaders in the United States, 82% in surveys done by CSIS say the best way to deal with China is to strengthen our alliances and our partnerships. The Quad is exactly that. It's politically now popular in the United States and in Australia and Japan and India. And it's logical strategically. It has bipartisan support in the US Congress. And it is the centerpiece in many ways of Biden's approach to the Indo-Pacific. We will see in the coming months an in-person Quad summit for the first time. The one Abe proposed that many foreign policy experts in all four countries poo-pooed, and governments on the left in all four countries canceled or did not implement. Now, in all four countries, the Labour Party in Australia and the Liberal or Conservative ruling party favor the Quad. In India and in Japan, and of course in the United States, both Democrats and Republicans favor the Quad. This is not, in my view, a sort of aberration or temporary thing, because although I said the Quad began in 2004 and 5, it actually has much longer roots in American strategic history. When Commodore Matthew Perry returned from opening Japan in the 1850s, he gave speeches in New York, which I write about in my last book, saying that someday the Pacific will be kept open and free by maritime cooperation by the US, Britain, and Japan. And at the end of the 19th century, Alfred Thayer Mahan, the most important strategic thinker in American history, argued that the US, Japan, Britain, and Germany, which was a new naval power at the time, would safeguard the Pacific. Germany, of course, is out of the picture largely. And Britain has been, though still interested in the Quad, replaced by its former colonies, by Australia and India. But this idea of maritime powers and more liberal democratic maritime powers preserving stability has deep roots in American strategic thinking and in British, therefore Australian and Japanese as well. This is really important for Taiwan because as China increases pressure on Taiwan militarily and attempts to isolate Taiwan internationally in terms of diplomacy, international space, and militarily, the PLA Navy and Air Force operations in the Indian Ocean, around Australia and the South China Sea, beyond the first and second island chain, these are also designed to make sure that no one can rescue Taiwan in a crisis. And the fact that the US, Japan, Australia, and India are increasingly working together, including in many ways, in particular on maritime security, that complicates Chinese planning. It will be very difficult for China to sustain its supply routes to energy in the Middle East if it has to fight its way through the Indian Navy, the Royal Australian Navy, the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Forces, and the US 5th and 7th Fleets. And we are still much better than China at undersea warfare, all of us. So this is not a collective security alliance. This is not a NATO. There's no treaty. There's no security commitment to each other than the US, Japan, and US Australia alliance, or to Taiwan necessarily. But this helps Taiwan because it complicates Chinese planning about how they would manage escalation in the event of a crisis in the Taiwan Strait. Where will the Quad go? Well, I think you'll continue to see maritime security cooperation. I do not think you'll see new members joining the Quad formally. It will remain the Quad with 4 countries. But you'll see countries participate a la carte. You'll see New Zealand, Canada, Britain, Holland, Korea, I think, participating in some maritime exercises in the provision of public goods, such as the vaccine rollout the Quad announced in its first summit under President Biden. I think in this, there will be some role for Taiwan. It may be in the area of infrastructure support in diplomatic allies of Taiwan, maybe in dialogues about how to strengthen democracy and governance. It certainly will be possible through second track scholarly exchanges on the security of the Taiwan Strait and how that really directly relates to the security of all the Quad countries in terms of sea lanes across the Indo-Pacific. The Quad is only one piece of the security architecture of the Indo-Pacific. And from Taiwan's perspective, the most important remains the ironclad U.S.-Japan alliance and increasingly the U.S.-Japan-Australia trilateral security relationship. But the Quad is a central piece now of this eclectic architecture for security in the Indo-Pacific. And I'm very pleased that you are talking about it today because it is an opportunity for Taiwan, perhaps not as a full member, but to think about how this new counterbalancing against Chinese hegemony in the Indo-Pacific by the maritime countries that share values and interests with Taiwan, how this can be harnessed and analyzed for Taiwan's own security. So I wish you a very fruitful discussion. I wish I were there, but I look forward to visiting Taipei and joining you in the not too distant future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike Green, and I believe all of us hear what Mike Green just said, and I'm very glad to hear that he mentioned about the importance of the Quad, especially to the security of Taiwan, and also how the Quad fit into the wider strategic concept and the security architecture within the Indo-Pacific. I think that Mike Green also mentioned about the establishment of the Quad, which first came out as a humanitarian missions. So I think that also as a testimony to the accusation against Quad as a military exclusive alliances targeting certain states. But it's not. It's actually coming from the humanitarian rescue mission trying to rescue lives. So that's why Quad was established, and then Quad later on coming ever stronger to help to safeguard the liberal international order in the Indo-Pacific. So without further ado, now let's turn to the Q&A sessions. The first question I have is actually coming from my good friend. He's also now online, Deputy Representative from Taiwan to India, Dr. Chen Mumin. This is a question to Admiral Lambda from India. His question is like this: does U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan encourage India to adjust its strategic postures? Will India shift its traditional strategic interest from Western borders and Central Asia to maritime domains, particularly South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific? So this question is basically about how the Afghanistan situation impact to the its own strategic thinking and to the wider India participation in the Quad itself. But I also like to broaden this question a little bit. So it's not just about how this will impact to the India and how India's position within the Quad, but will Quad consider the issue about Afghanistan, the necessity to respond to it as a credibility test for the Quad? So the first question to our Indian Admiral, and then I would like to ask both the Taniguchi and Peter to answer probably my broader questions. So Admiral, please.
Thank you. The situation in Afghanistan at the moment is evolving and dynamic. Okay. Taliban has assumed power. The US has withdrawn after 20 years. Today is the last day where they're going to be there. There have been now, Taliban has been saying of a more inclusive government formation in Kabul. India has invested a great deal over the last 20 years in Afghanistan. It's not only the last 20 years. There have been long-standing links between Afghanistan and India, which goes back centuries. Is it going to change India's focus towards the land borders at the cost of the maritime domain? I don't think so that is going to happen. The maritime domain and the maritime dimension is now firmly at the center stage of the government of India in New Delhi. And I think there is an evolution of thought process where India's future is fundamentally linked to the Indo-Pacific. There are, it is too early to call, but there are talks about what linkages Pakistan has with Afghanistan, whether there will be outflow of terrorism from Afghanistan, but at the moment Taliban has said they're not going to allow their territory or their country to be used for this purpose. So it's too early to call, But I don't think so there is going to be any reduction in India's commitment to the maritime security environment and to the Quad. I think the engagements are only going to grow. Does the Quad have a role to play in Afghanistan? It's too early to tell. It depends on what sort of government is formed in Kabul, what sort of policies they're going to take. And I think it'll be the individual government's call on what sort of relationship you're going to have with the government of the day in Kabul. If it is a more inclusive government, less based on Sharia and all that, then there may be a role of the members of the Quad looking at engagement with the government in Kabul and recognition of the government in Kabul. But I think it's too early to call. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Amaro. And Peter, please.
Thank you. Well, I think the first thing to say about Afghanistan is that for America's allies, it seems to me that it has to force a question about the reliability and consistency of America as a security partner. I know there are some people saying, oh, well, this now frees the United States from a Middle East commitment in ways that it can put more emphasis on the Indo-Pacific. But really, the truth of the matter is that the withdrawal, if it was necessary, was very badly handled. I think it's done damage to the Biden administration. And really now the challenge for America's allies is to help the United States back from that experience to be the most effective partner that it can be. In the Australian context, in a few weeks' time, we will have a bilateral annual ministers level meeting with the US called OSMINT. And I think this is going to be our first opportunity to engage with the US. I favour Australia coming forward with an ambitious plan to grow our own alliance relationship with the Americans, to give them every reason to want to stay actively engaged in our security and in the security of the Indo-Pacific. On the future of Afghanistan, I would just very quickly say that it seems to me that the G7 under the leadership of Boris Johnson is emerging as the most effective group for aligning democratic responses to what has happened in Afghanistan. There was a virtual meeting of the G7 on Afghanistan the other day. I was disappointed that Australia was not invited to that in the way that we had been invited to the G7 meeting in Cornwall just a few months ago, because outside of NATO, we were one of the largest troop contributors to the Afghanistan military operation. So perhaps a somewhat enhanced G7 with Australia and India along, India because of clear geographic interest, would become a useful vehicle for managing democratic responses to Afghanistan. And there, I think it's important that we try to align how we're going to deal with the Taliban. I think it would be very damaging if we found different approaches from the different democracies. So that would be my sort of suggestion for how to manage the Afghanistan situation going forward.
Thank you. And Professor Taniguchi?
Right. In Afghanistan, Japan has long pioneered in the area of soldiers' DDR, or disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration into the society. Tokyo has also helped foster trusted civilian police force, including, importantly, female policy officers. For those involved in such valuable endeavors, the sense of loss is enormous. It's not going to go away easily. And yet, for the United States loss-making Afghani operations, the most opportune time for a, say, stop loss, as with financial investment, is always now. The Biden administration, furthermore, has done what the previous administrations pledged to do. Combined, that awareness has led very few in the Tokyo-based policy-forming circle to get surprised at the U.S. withdrawal. Looking into the future, freed from the mountain terrain, the U.S. could focus its defense planning on the Indo-Pacific seascape. It is in the Indo-Pacific theater that the U.S. could finally concentrate its military assets, all of which is a net, positive, welcome development for Japan and I would say Australia, India, and for the ASEAN nations. Tokyo, as a host of the great assets of forward deployed forces of the United States, is indeed willing to do more with the U.S. that is oriented toward the theater. And I found what Peter Jennings told us all very much sensible, and I especially think the role to be played by G7 or G7 Plus is going to be very much important and pertinent. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Taniguchi. When you talk about Afghanistan, it just reminds me about Taiwan actually at that time also have a role to play. In year 2002, at the first Afghanistan International Rescue conferences, the people coming from Afghanistan, including later the President Karazi, they were actually taking the plane from Taiwan, flew from the Middle East and stopped over Taiwan and then to Tokyo. So because I was stationed at Tokyo at that time, so we helped about this affair. So that reminds me about this endeavor that we were also part of this altogether. Now the next questions, I just glanced through some of that. We have the reporter from the Central News Agency who was asking about the China policy changes within Australia. Because in the past, the people in Taiwan, we used to believe that the Australia, probably due to the economic interdependence with China, so tend to be softer on its approach toward China. But right now, of course, Australia is having a much stiffer and hardened its positions. But then, do you think that the Australia has actually shifted its China policy in the wake of China's assertiveness? So that was a question to Peter Jennings. But I also like to broaden a little bit because this year and the next year, we are going to have a major election for both Japan and Australia. And Mike Green, in his pre-recorded messages, he also mentioned about how the first Quad collapsed in year 2007. That was due to the political transitions in both Japan, in both Australia, and later on the United States. So that the Quad initiative at that time just collapsed. So people would like to ask that would the Quad will have its stamina to continue to sustain even after the possible political transition in both Australia or to some lesser extent in Japan. So I'd like to ask both our Peter and Taniguchi to answer these questions. Peter? Last time, Peter, you go first. So let me invite Taniguchi first.
Sure. Right. The world has changed dramatically since 2007. Mike Green spent a lot of time discussing what sort of changes have occurred in the interim, so I would not add anything further. May I just say, nonetheless, that institutionalization of security have been in place in Japan more in a robust way than in 2007. What's more important, however, is that the course, trajectory to be taken by China is going to be rather one direction because Xi Jinping's China, by the way, Xi Jinping is determined to be in place as long as his biological life makes it possible. Under Xi Jinping, China is going to have to celebrate many benchmark events, the biggest one of which is 2049, when the PRC must celebrate its centenary. And aiming at that period, China is determined to build its economy, build its military, and build its international power even more so than previously. So in essence, the importance of these four freedom-loving democratic nations coming together is also going to gain more value rather than losing any sort of values. And as with the United States and as with, I would say, Australia, this perception about China's rise has gained bipartisan support in many countries. I'm also talking about in Japan, but also not only in Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific. If you look at Germany, and that's been becoming a case more so than in the past. So my answer is Quad is going to be less affected by the by the changes of government, by the events that would happen in countries such as Japan and Australia politically. Yes.
All right, Peter, please.
Thank you. There's been a decisive shift in public opinion on China, largely created by Beijing's own bad behaviour. If Beijing had stuck to peaceful rise, I think they would have a more sympathetic audience in Australia. But over the course of 2020 and this year, there has been a complete collapse of public trust in Beijing. And I don't think that's going to change. I also think that for as long as Xi Jinping is in power, there is also going to be a more hostile Chinese approach towards Australia. And what we're seeing as a result of that is a diversification of our economy away from that deep dependence that we had built on China, and really a collapse of Chinese foreign investment into Australia. So things have changed very quickly, and I think will remain in a situation where Australia has to have where we are more concentrated on the risks rather than the opportunities presented by the Chinese economy. Now, we will have an election probably in the first quarter of 2022. No sensible strategist makes election predictions in Australia. In fact, what I will predict is that it's going to be close. But if we have a change of government, I think what you'll see is a very similar set of foreign policy objectives pursued by an Australian Labor government, which would continue to support the Quad. So I agree actually with all the speakers that have been on this really quite fascinating panel that I think the Quad is going to be here to stay for the long haul. And now it is up to creative policymakers to find substance to give to Quad activities. And if we're clever about how we do that, the Quad will grow to become a more important instrument of our collective foreign policy authority in the Indo-Pacific region.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. We do not have much time, but I have tons of questions. So I had to be very selective, but I think that's a tribute to all of your very succinct and clear presentations. The next question is actually about the country outside of the Indo-Pacific. We do know that some European states like the United Kingdom, France, and also Germany, they're going to sail their boats in the Indo-Pacific area this year. And also notice that the European Union, as well as the Germany, France, and even the Holland, Dutch, they initiate their own Indo-Pacific strategies. So how would the Quad consider about, especially from the Europe, those out of area countries, their role and contribution? And of course, I know all of you seems to suggest that it's better to consolidate Quad as now rather than trying to expand the membership. But how do you view those European countries, for examples, about their potential contribution or their probably challenges in your Quad formulation regarding Indo-Pacific area. So those are questions not to all. Probably that will be the last one. So first, I start with the Murrow from India, and then the Peter and Taniguchi. Thank you.
I think you're absolutely right. At the moment, the 4 members of the Quad are here to consolidate. If you're looking at Europe, I think the most reliable partner or country from Europe which can play a role is France. She is an Indian Ocean country, also a Pacific country which has territory, and have permanent presence of military force both in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific. And India has a long-standing strategic relationship with France, which goes back decades and decades. And France has been one of the most reliable partners. So in my opinion, in case there's any country in Europe which will commit to playing a role in the Indo-Pacific, it's most likely going to be France. And I think I'll stop here and give an opportunity to both my co-panelists.
Thank you. Peter?
Well, I'd just say very quickly that I think the interest of the European countries in the Indo-Pacific is very welcome. And any contribution can be appreciated. If the French, the British, the Germans want to cooperate more closely with the countries of the region, particularly Southeast Asia, that is going to be a net plus, bringing more decent democracies into the region and further complicating China's own plans. So from my perspective, it's a great outcome. I would also say that one of the unintended consequences of China's hostility towards Australia is that we have rediscovered Europe, which we do every 30 or so years, as a market and as a place to collaborate with. And so the opportunities for us to grow our security cooperation with all of those countries is something which I think is very, very welcome indeed.
Thank you. And Dr. Taniguchi?
Right. To follow on what we have just heard from Peter Jennings, the Australia-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement gave headway to the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and TPP paved the way for EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement. And EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement has another pillar focusing on the political relationship between the EU and Japan, named Strategic Partnership Agreement. It is to pronounce that when it comes to making norms and rules, they ought to be done by democratic powers. And Europe and Japan must be two of those central pillars to enhance such rules-based international order. With that background, may I just say that we are now witnessing an increased interest from among those select few European countries in utilizing each country's naval assets. And Navy is mobile, and you have to feed the sailors, you have to fuel the boats and ships, even ported. So at sea, there is not so much substantial difference between the cost incurred when ported and cost they demand at sea. So it is very much an easy way for France, Germany, the Netherlands, and of course the United Kingdom to use those military, especially naval assets, to show to the rest of the world that they are interested in the peace and security of the region. And that is more than welcome.
Thank you. I think in Europe, not just about the Germany, France, and the Netherlands, they show their interest in the naval asset. We also need to notice that Russia just published its Indo-Pacific strategy in July. So that is another important player, which we do not have time to discuss. And in terms of the Quad, I just have to mention for my own country, although we do know that the expansion of the Quad right now is not in the consideration, but Taiwan is definitely would like to see the opportunity to be any kind of the Quad Plus project, because we also believe that Taiwan could contribute to the Quad, and the existence of Quad itself will be very important for the Taiwan security, which is very critical to our survival. So thank you all for a very engaging and thoughtful conversation that we just had. Unfortunately, Mike Green just cannot participate here with us, but I believe that next time we'll try to get everyone together, and not just online, but in face. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you very much.